Good Grief is a really brilliant episode of Frasier. On the one hand, it's quite a heavy start to season 6, but at the same time, I think it's pretty fantastic, and there's a lot of value in this episode, and definitely some comedy as well, but certainly some quite heavy moments. This is, of course, the first episode of the 6th season of Frasier. This is directed by Pamela Fryman, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. And as always with Frasier, I will go through things chronologically, and actually with this one, it's pretty easy to discuss chronologically because the episode goes through the various stages of grief that Frasier is going through, and I'll talk about this more in a moment. So I will talk about kind of each stage and how it manifests in Frasier. And what I love about this as well is that it shows, and this is something Niles actually says quite early on, but we'll get to that in a moment, that it shows that grief, we obviously automatically associate grief with the loss of a loved one, the loss of a person or a pet, but also you can go through those stages when you lose something else that's so significant. And in this case, this is of course Frasier losing his job at KSCL, as we saw at the end of the previous episode. This one actually starts off with a ray of hope. We are being deceived for a couple of seconds, as it looks like Frasier has got a job on a TV show, but it turns out he's actually just auditioning for Medical Minute. And then he's over in the apartment, and this is Denial. And we have the stage on screen in the cards, and he's playing the piano with Martin. He's got a lot of different projects on the go. He seems rather upbeat because he's in denial. Martin also tries to show Frasier his new trick with Eddie, and Eddie has a couple of shining moments in this, which I was rather pleased about. Daphne spends the episode running errands for Frasier, basically doing everything that he asks her, and he asks quite a lot of her. And then Niles comes over, and he explains to Martin that Frasier is in the denial stage of the 5 stages of grief because his whole identity revolved around his job, his career, and now that he's lost that, he's basically mourning that death. And I think that that's something really important to highlight, because for some people they might not see losing a job as being that significant. Obviously it's a tragic thing, but they might not see it as being worthy of grieving. But when it's your identity, and I'm speaking as somebody who can relate to this, losing that is going to be a horrific experience, not just because of the financial loss, but because you're basically losing part of you, a big part of you. And I think the episode does a really great job of showing this. It also means that it can be quite relatable to a lot of people. Regardless of what you're grieving, I think it could potentially be really helpful. And we also find out in this stage that Frasier didn't get the Medical Minute job. We're then down at a picnic. That's for people, former KSCL employees who had been fired because of Frasier's approaches, and he ends up entering the anger stage. Everybody there is finding out good things, they're getting jobs, and instead of giving Frasier hope that that could happen to him, he becomes very angry at the situation, and he takes it out on a piñata. Brilliant performance. Quite a heavy moment, but very, very well done. And then we enter the bargaining stage. And what I love about this is Niles' role in this episode is to explain things, usually to Martin, to explain what that stage is and what it involves and potentially why they're entering that phase. And I really like that we had that, just a few lines from Niles every now and then to explain what was happening. And he explains to Martin that Frasier is going to be in the bargaining stage where you make a bargain with God or whoever it is you believe is in charge of the universe from your belief. And this is what Frasier explains. He's having a fan club party at the apartment, and this is because he'd prayed to God for guidance, and the guidance he received was to take better care of your fans. And if he does that, he believes he'll get his old life back, which is a good message in a sense, because Frasier realises that maybe he took those fans for granted. And, well, I was going to say to some extent, the fans are the reason he had his career. And that's definitely true to a degree. But when the fan club arrives, I'm not entirely sure how responsible those 3 people could be for the success of Frasier's career. There are 3 people in his fan club, and they were really interesting characters, definitely very unique individuals, very obsessed with Frasier, and honestly, I found it to be very funny. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. I loved how they entered the apartment, and I say both of them, there were two of them initially, and then the third guy came in, but eventually they all just gravitated towards Eddie. And I have to say, I would do the same thing. I would absolutely go towards Eddie. He's absolutely adorable in this episode. And his fan club actually had a rally to persuade people to let Frasier back on the air, which Frasier thought would be a great thing until he learned that there were only 3 members of his fan club. And needless to say, the rally didn't exactly go according to plan. We then cut to the depression stage. And this is basically highlighted with the fact that Frasier has been eating his feelings. And there's a bit of an intervention. Roz comes over, and Frasier was looking after baby Alice, and Roz had some cameras installed because a nanny was stealing from her. And the cameras basically showed Frasier stealing food from Alice. Granted, Alice wasn't that interested in the food, but he was eating the baby food and really finding comfort in that, and he didn't want to admit that it was a problem. He was in control of the situation, and Niles points out that he will stay in the depression stage unless he allows himself to accept the situation and grieve the situation. And it seems like Frasier is about to enter that stage, but he needs a little push. So it seems quite harsh, but Niles said to him quite loudly and clearly, "Frasier, you're not famous anymore." And the floodgates opened, and Frasier was now in the acceptance stage, sobbing and sobbing and sobbing. The performance from Kelsey Grammer is brilliant. And again, it's quite heavy. But then we get the comedy to lift it back up a little bit, because Frasier says it's all over, which triggers Eddie to do his special trick that Martin has taught him. And while Frasier's sobbing and writhing around in the background, we just see Eddie walking into the centre of the room, and he does his little rollover, and it's absolutely adorable. And then we end with the final scene, and Frasier and Niles are in Cafe Nervosa. Frasier thanks Niles for his help, and then Niles enters a stage of denial regarding his relationship, and the cycle begins. And then, of course, we end with a beautiful scene with Eddie doing his trick with Frasier. I always love some positive interaction between Frasier and Eddie, and it's a really adorable, very light-hearted way to end things. I think it's a really fabulous episode, and I kind of like the fact that they're dealing with grief, but it's not the death of a person. I think if they were to highlight the stages of grief following the death of a person, then that would be a little too heavy. It's not that it couldn't work. I think they would do a good job with it. But by making it the loss of a career, and therefore a loss of Frasier's identity, it's not quite as heavy. And I think that's largely because Frasier can get that back. That's not something that's gone forever. Whereas obviously the death of a person, that's not quite the case. So I think they did a great job of tackling a heavy subject while also making it a little bit lighter so that we don't lose the comedy aspect of the sitcom. I don't know if I have any personal highlights. I think Niles' involvement here and the role he played in explaining the different stages, I thought that was really beneficial, really well done. Obviously, Eddie's trick. I absolutely loved Eddie in this. I just think the way everything unfolded was really well done, and I quite liked the intervention as well, because it helped to show that actually Roz was being a bit stronger than Frasier, and that maybe there are other ways of looking at the situation, as Roz was able to do. Granted, her career isn't quite as much of her identity as it is for Frasier's. Frasier's being, making him a public figure, it's a bit more in his face. For example, earlier on, he's handed a poster of himself that's no longer there. And it's a different situation for Frasier. But if other people are able to work through it, maybe there's hope for Frasier. And that's not to say everybody should compare their situation to other people's, but I like the fact that Roz was having a very different reaction to this, and she was able to provide that support for Frasier when he needed it. But in general, it's still quite a heavy episode. And that being said, I really thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a really strong, kind of heavy start to season 6. It also doesn't answer all of the questions either, because obviously at the end of season 5, the big question is, what's Frasier going to do next? what's his career going to be? What's his next move? And this episode doesn't answer that. And I like the fact that we still have to wait a little bit to get those answers. Good Grief is a solid episode, very, very well handled, and ultimately, I really thoroughly enjoyed it.